Amendment by Dutton. Chair recognizes Representative Dutton.
Mr. Speaker and members, I know it's been a long day and most of us are tired, but let me get you to
Alvarado is dropping her.
take a breath and see if you can get your brain moving. So far, the amendments we have had have been about both politics or the policy of abortion. And what this amendment does is neither of those. What this amendment does is talks about the principle underlying this bill. One of the things that I have done is in talking about this bill and talking about the whole issue of abortion and listening to people and reading about it, it struck me that one of the things our governor said was that this bill was about the sanctity of life. It's about the sanctity of life and how precious life is. And so therefore, we had to pass this bill based on that principle.
We know that.
Well, I think that if you start with the principle that underlies this bill as the sanctity of life, then that ought to apply to a whole bunch of other things that we do in this legislature. One of the things is that we are in this bill telling one person that you ought not to have the right to decide life. One person, that's what we're saying in this bill. But what we also have in statute is we allow 12 people to decide life for some people. And we decide that, well, wait a minute, 12 people can put somebody to death in the state, but now we want one person to not be able to decide that same issue. For me, the principle is the same. And the principle says that if we value life in this state, if we think life, that the sanctity of life is something that transcends everything we do, which is the principle that underlies this bill, then I think you ought to vote for this amendment. Because what this amendment does is simply says that, wait a minute, we are going to value all life in this state. We're going to value life such that when it gets to a criminal trial in this state, we will no longer sanction the death penalty. Now, I know that some people don't make the connection. Some people can't figure out how to get from this bill to our statute on the death penalty. But I think that if you'll really sit in your chair where you are and you really come to grips with what underlies your whole basis for trying to outlaw abortion, what you'll find is that the basis is only because you believe that every life is precious. And if every life is precious, I don't know how you somehow or another begin to change that just because of circumstances related to a criminal trial. If you don't want one person to decide life and death, why would you agree to let 12 people decide it for somebody? It doesn't make, intellectually it doesn't make sense. It may make sense on some other orders, but it doesn't make sense in terms of whether or not this state ought to be in the business of executing people. And if you don't want one person in this state in the business of executing people, why would you ever permit 12 people to do it? That's the principle under which I offer this amendment.
Only got 2 more.
And
Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Simpson, for what purpose?
to raise a point of order on further consideration of this amendment based upon Rule 11, Section 2.
Bring your point of order down front. Point of order is respectfully overruled. Chair recognizes Representative Dutton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We finally gave the death penalty to that motion. Let me tell you, members, I understand why some people don't like this, because what it challenges is their whole principle and premise which underlies their belief about eliminating abortions. Because if you say to yourself, and you can say to yourself comfortably, that I believe that abortions ought to be outlawed because I believe in the sanctity of life, which a lot of the people in the gallery obviously hear because of, and they're wearing blue because they believe in the sanctity of life. Well, if you believe in the sanctity of life, what you're really saying is that I do not believe that anybody except the Almighty ought to be in charge of life and death. And if you accept that premise, how do you change it when you get to the issue of whether or not this state ought to be in the business of instituting the death penalty. You can't. Not intellectually you can't. You can if you somehow or another want to be able to say to yourself that somehow or another, I don't believe the state ought to sanction abortion, but I do believe the state ought to sanction capital punishment and the death penalty. The two, in my opinion, are so intellectually inconsistent that whoever can stand before their God and justify the two, I believe they're standing before the wrong God.
Senator Taylor raised a point of order. Gentleman's time expired. Point of order is well taken to say. Chair recognizes Representative Laubenberg in opposition.
Again, members, I move to table this amendment. It would, the amendment is designed to abolish the death penalty for certain criminal offenses. The operative word is criminal offenses. The individual must have been accused of a crime and judged by a jury, convicted by that jury, having the burden of proof put on the state, and they also have the ability to appeal, whereas in abortion, you're dealing with an innocent victim who does not have any ability to appeal. I move to table.
Chair recognizes Representative Dutton to close.
Should the state have a greater right than a person? Does the state have a greater right to terminate a life than a person does? What Ms. Laubenberg says is that, well, the person's been found guilty. If this bill had it in it that 12 people could decide whether a woman ought to have an abortion, would it not be the same thing? Would it not be the same thing? Just because somehow or another some people want to suggest that the sanctity of life only relates to when you're born. The sanctity of life does not end or begin simply when you're born. The principle of the sanctity of life exists throughout. And what it suggests is that the person who decided that you could be a born person is the only person, only entity that can decide to terminate your life. Now, most of us in here, when we voted for the statute creating the death penalty in this state, we didn't think about abortion. We didn't think about how that was going to position us in terms of our intellectual ability to figure out whether or not that ought to apply to abortion. But let me tell you something. If you can make a distinction between exterminating a life, then you don't really care about whether abortions exist or not. If you can decide that, well, I don't really care. I think that the state ought to have the right to punish people by sending them to death because 12 people decided it. But then on the other hand, a person who decides to have abortion ought not to have that kind of power. I don't think that's the state most of you all here believe in. And you know how I know that? Because you believe that the state ought to be limited in its rights. You believe that the superior right of an individual is greater than the right of the state. But what you're saying in voting against this amendment is that I don't believe that. I believe that in some situations, the state ought to have the right to invade the privacy of the sanctity of life, and that an individual doesn't. Because what this amendment does is simply says that if we're going to do away with abortions in this state, once we can do that. But we will do it only insofar as the Attorney General in this state certifies in the public record that we have decided to do away with capital punishment. Now, You know, it's amazing to me that intellectually, Democrats in this body seem to be against abortion. But Republicans seem to be for capital punishment. Now, I don't know how each of those parties walks the line intellectually to get to a point where they feel comfortable with the position they're taking. If this amendment goes on, I'll vote for this bill. If this amendment goes on, I'll vote for this bill. Because I believe that the sanctity of life governs everything that we do, and it decides that, wait a minute, there's a point beyond which we cannot go as individuals. And we cannot go insofar as this legislature. And I believe that when we decide to take a life, we have gone beyond not only our legislative authority, but we have gone beyond the authority vested in us by the Creator. And if the Creator decided to create an individual, I think we are bound by that Creator to let that person live so long as the Creator decided they should live. And so I would ask you to vote no on the motion to table, members. I know this is one of those times where there seems to be a party vote. There seems to be 90 people here who are against every amendment that comes up. But this is the only amendment that tests your principle. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I ask you to vote no on the motion to table.
Mr. Dutton sends up an amendment. Representative Laubenberg moves to table. This is on the motion to table. It's a record vote. Clerk, ring the bell. So, Ms. Laubenberg voting aye. Mr. Dutton voting no. Have all voted? Have all members voted? 96 ayes and 49 nays. Motion to table prevails. Following amendment. Clerk, read the amendment.